Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives, where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is October 23rd, 2013, and my guest is Don Boudreaux of George Mason University. Don and I share the blog Cafe Hayek. Don, welcome back to EconTalk.
Glad to be here.
Our topic for today is the intellectual legacy of Ronald Coase, the Nobel laureate who passed away in September at the age of 102. And Coase was a guest on EconTalk in May of 2012. Don, today's guest, is a longtime teacher of law and economics, and contributor to the literature. And I thought it'd be nice to talk about Coase's intellectual legacy. So we're going to talk about his most important papers today, of which they're a relatively small number, but incredibly influential.
Coase wrote more than most people realize he wrote, but when you compare his total corpus to that of most Nobel Prize-winning economists, it is relatively small.
Shockingly small.
Yeah.
In terms of number.
Yeah, huge in terms of insight per word.
And influence on the profession as well.
Yeah.
So we're going to focus, just to give people a heads up, we're going to focus on four of his papers. The two most important are The Nature of the Firm, which was published in 1937 in Economica, and The Problem of Social Cost, which was published in 1960 in the Journal of Law and Economics. But hoping we'll have time at the end to give significant time for The Marginal Cost Controversy, which is 1946 in Economica. And The Lighthouse in Economics, which is Journal of Law and Economics, 1974.
I believe 74.
74. And we'll put links as best we can to those. There's certainly some of them may be gated, but there are also books that have collected those of Coase's essays. But those are the big four. He did, as you point out, he wrote other things as well, and they're all interesting.
Yep.
But those are the four we're going to focus on today, I think, that had the most lasting impact. So let's start with The Nature of the Firm, published in 1937, a long time ago, and yet a paper that still gets a lot of attention.
Yeah, The Nature of the Firm and The Problem of Social Cost, these are the two that were understandably singled out by the Nobel Prize Committee in 1991 when Coase was awarded, justifiably, the Nobel Prize. That paper grew out of a trip that Coase had made with a fellow student, I believe, to the United States, a research trip. He was a student, Coase was, at the London School of Economics, where he encountered Hayek. Hayek was one of his professors. His main professor was Arnold Plant. Arnold Plant was very interested in accounting and did some work in the economics of accounting, as did Coase. And Coase got a fellowship in the early 1930s to travel to the U.S., and he studied actual business organization. And at some point, it dawned on him that the way economists talk about the firm is a black box. We don't really, to this day, we don't really say much what goes on inside of the firm. And
some things go in, labor, materials, and things come out, products, services.
Firms are, as we economists say, production functions. They have certain technologies for transforming inputs into outputs, and they take the input prices as given, or if they're monopsonous, they can affect them somehow. And then they produce these outputs. And Coase said, well, let's that may be okay for certain theoretical purposes, but let's investigate more. Why are there firms? It's a straightforward question. And very few economists until that time, I say very few, maybe none, but certainly very few economists, asked the question, why are there firms? They asked what are firms, but why are there firms? And Coase's answer, in a nutshell, is there are firms because there are transaction costs. Firms for Coase are institutional devices for dealing with transaction costs, for minimizing the consequences of transactions costs. And we can talk in more detail about exactly what his theory about the firm was. But it's interesting that Coase wrote that paper in The Nature of the Firm. He wrote in 1931. So he was 21 years old when he wrote a paper for which he won the Nobel Prize 70 years later.
Yeah, I'm going to just say that this is the It's Wednesday, October 23rd when we're taping this. So Coase was kind of the Xander Bogaerts of economics. That's an inside baseball reference for Red Sox fans. Go ahead, Don. I'm sorry about that.
Well, it's okay. Always good to have a good sports reference when the fall, because the fall classic starts tonight with the Red Sox and the Cardinals. So Coase wrote the paper when he was 21. You think, well, what did I do when I was 21? I was, just struggling with calculus and things. And it wasn't published until 6 years later. I'm sure he polished it a bit. But to this day, the nature of the firm, which is a very straightforward article, to this day, the nature of the firm remains the foundation of all the best theoretical work that economists do on the theory of the firm. Much has been built upon that foundation. But Coase's fundamental insight remains.
It's more than a foundation in the way that, say, Adam Smith's work on the Wealth of Nations is a foundation, which it is. Mm-hmm. But Coase's article is worth reading today, not just for, of course, the Wealth of Nations is also. You can still learn something today from the Wealth of Nations. But I don't know if there are many articles written in 1937 that a modern economist can read profitably, understand, learn something from, and be stimulated by. And when you said it's straightforward, I think what you meant was it's not theoretical, it's not technical, it's not mathematical.
It's theoretical. It's not mathematical.
It's not mathematical. It's bristling with insight and interesting observations.
Yes, and the fundamental insight is this. Coase asked, look, we economists have this theory that shows that resources are allocated according to prices. Sellers sell to willing buyers, and through this process, resources and goods and services get moved around the economy from where they're valued less to where they're valued more. He said, so why do we need firms? Why doesn't all production take place across what I call ownership boundaries? Why does General Motors, for example, own the Fisher Body Company, to pick a famous example later used? Why did it buy the Fisher Body Company? Why does General Motors make the bodies for its own automobiles?
And by doing so, lose the power of the price system to induce competition, excellence, innovation, all the things that we like as economists about the market process when they're put inside a firm, have become a top-down, to be blunt, socialist command and control system that seemingly gives up all the advantages of price and competition.
It is what a firm is what Hayek called, and remember, Coase was a student of Hayek. A firm is what Hayek called an organization. It is administered from on top, and it's conducted according to some conscious direction. And Coase said, so why do we have this? If the market's so great, why do we have these? I think it was Dennis Robertson who called them islands of conscious power in a sea of markets. Why do we have these things? And Coase said, well, it's because, look, markets, as wonderful as they are, contrary to what simple textbook basic economic theory might imply, markets have transaction costs. Contracting in a market is not costless. People have to worry about the honesty of the people with whom they're contracting. They have to worry about will the quality of the thing that I'm contracting to buy, will it be what I expect?
Sometimes it won't be. I have to then deal with the implications of that. I have to have a contractual or legal way to cope with the surprises.
Yes, there are a variety of different sources of transaction costs. And Coase said when the transaction costs of using the market are sufficiently high, it's worthwhile to take those transactions out of markets and put them into the firm. Now, the firm itself is not a costless thing to operate. There are costs of operating a firm. I call these administrative costs. So you have the cost of using the markets on one hand versus administrative costs on the other hand.
And those costs are?
Well, the manager of the firm has to consciously direct workers. Okay, you guys, when you finish doing that, move those intermediate products from there to here, and then you people do it this way: paint them green or paint them red, or make sure you ship them to Toledo, or make sure you ship them to Tijuana. So it has to be.
But that's the smallest. I mean, the bigger challenge is you got to figure out what technology to use.
Yes.
What skills to use. What mix of people and machinery that normally you just say, well, I'll just go find the cheapest one that meets, when you go out in the marketplace, you don't think about this at all. You just, I want to find the cheapest one that meets my quality expectations. Yes. All of a sudden, you have to wonder, am I doing this the best way?
Yes.
And you may not be. So there's those costs of discovering mistakes, et cetera.
That's right.
You've got loafing, which again, in the competitive external market, you just say, well, you're late. We're done.
Yeah.
I'll find somebody else. But here you're saying, the guy says, well, we had this bottleneck. How do you know it's real? So it seems to be the monitoring and quality control product and decision-making process within the firm is by far the biggest cost.
Of course, you're right. Yeah. So the general lesson here is Coase is a realist. He said, look, markets aren't perfect. Administrative direction isn't perfect. They both have their costs. And in a competitive economy, when people are allowed to experiment with different organizational forms and markets aren't constrained excessively by regulation to fit some model, then what will happen is over time, firms will emerge, depending on the industry, depending on existing technologies, firms will emerge that minimize the entire costs of transforming raw materials into final products for delivery to consumers. You have costs, still have costs of using markets, you have administrative costs, but if firms get too large, then the administrative costs at the margin outweigh the cost of using the market, so firms will shrink. If the cost of using the market are too high at the margin, firms will emerge to reduce those costs and substitute the lower administrative costs for the cost of using the market, all the while lowering the total cost of, again, transforming raw materials into final outputs. And it's an astonishingly simple insight, but no one had it until Coase discovered it. And this is a theme that runs throughout all of Ronald Coase's work. He recognized when economists overlooked obvious questions, and he asked questions that, once they're asked, seem important to ask, but no one thought to ask them before Ronald Coase asked them. And that's a really important role to play. And the nature of the firm is an example of that. Why are there firms? I've often said about that, it's easier to understand the nature of the firm if you think of it first as really a theory of vertical integration. It works for horizontal integration as well, or even conglomerate
Explain
forms.
what you mean by vertical and horizontal
vertical integration is the economist's term for the integration within one firm of different stages of production. So I used earlier the example of General Motors and Fisher Body. General Motors makes the bodies, then it attaches the bodies to the chassis, then it puts the motor in it. So you have these different stages of production extending back from the raw material extractive stages where you get iron ore out of the ground all the way to the final stage where you run a dealership that delivers the product to the final consumer.
And of course, any of those stages you could either outsource, meaning get it from outside the firm.
Use the market,
or you could produce them in-house.
Yes.
And they do a mix of both.
Yes. And you can imagine one firm, Giant Corp, having its own iron ore exploration division and extracting ore from the ground and smelting the ore, turning it into steel, turning that steel into auto bodies, and having its own rubber plant. Actually, for a while, I think Henry Ford did indeed have that. All the way to actually owning the dealership. But we don't see that. We see General Motors doing and other car companies doing some of it, but not all of it. It contracts out parts of it, both in earlier stages of production and in latter stages of production. And Coase's theory is, again, remains the starting point for economists understanding why, in particular circumstances, certain processes are integrated within a firm and why, in other circumstances, the processes occur across ownership boundaries in markets.
I never thought about it until just now. A similar set of factors come into play when I decide what to do on my own inside my house versus hire someone to do.
Yes.
So we talk in economics about comparative advantage, which one way of saying one way I like to think about comparative advantage is that self-sufficiency is the road to poverty. If you try to do everything for yourself, you're going to be very poor because you have a limited set of both time and skills. And so, if you think about it, there are a lot of things inside your house that you end up doing for yourself because transaction costs. So you take out, I'll just speak for myself. You can, most of us, I think, are in this situation. I take out my own garbage. I change my own light bulbs. There's 1,000 things I do around my house.
And you could hire someone to do that.
I could hire to do. And in fact, the previous owner of our house hired someone to change all the light bulbs in a whole set of lights in our house because they were up high, and he didn't want to get the ladder, and he didn't want to climb the ladder. He didn't have the ladder. He didn't want to climb the ladder, so he paid someone actually to change his light bulbs, at least for some of the light bulbs. But the point is that if I could instantaneously say, oh, I'll give you 75 cents to change a bunch of light bulbs, I might decide not to do that myself. I might let someone pay someone, but the cost of finding that person, getting him to my house, waiting for him, letting him in, all those quote transaction costs.
Dealing with the risk that person may be dishonest or incompetent.
Correct.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of things that I do inside my house where I don't have a comparative advantage in a way, and you'd think I would contract out for them, but I don't. And that's because this factor, which is a beautiful application. Just
really quickly, I heard yesterday that Jerry Jones, the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, when he's sitting in the owner's box watching a football game, he has someone beside him to clean his glasses. So when his glasses get dirty, I don't know if that's true, but I heard someone say that and it sounded like they were telling the truth. So that's really contracting out.
He's
to another party.
But for him, evidently, I clean my own glasses. I don't know about you.
So do I.
So for me, the cost of having someone next to me to do that for me isn't worth it. But for him, evidently in his situation, is maybe he's not very good at cleaning. As well, he may be inferior.
Yeah.
Maybe a case of absolute advantage in that case. So, as you said, this is just a few more moments on this paper. It seems like you said it's a simple insight. Mm-hmm. One view is that it's like many insights, as you say.
Simple insight that no one had before Coase.
Correct. So it's one of these things. Oh well, that's obvious.
Yeah.
But it wasn't obvious at the time. Mm-hmm. But it's more than just that it was obvious, and now we know it. It has implications, and has had implications for research in industrial organization. Of course, we're going to apply in a minute to the case of externalities and public policy, which is what Coase came to do in his next paper, the next paper we're going to talk about. But talk, if you can, besides the fact that it, quote, explains why firms use socialism within the firm. And of course, some firms use market competition they do things in-house, but they still try to leverage the price system. They might have competing divisions. I know there are retailers that their stores, they have an in-house arm that creates clothing for their retail stores, but the retail store is allowed to buy from anyone. Mm-hmm. So they're not forced to buy from the in-house supplier. They can buy from anyone. So there's competition forcing that in-house supplier to compete with the outside suppliers.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of creative ways that firms try to leverage and get the power of competition in markets. But is there anything else you want to say about what the influence this paper had on how economists think about firms and organization?
Well, again, and we'll talk about this in an even broader context in a moment, I'm sure. But the underlying insight here is the importance of transaction costs. Until the nature of the firm was published, economists paid little attention to transaction costs. In fact, I don't know if they paid any attention to them at all. I confess I haven't read Marshall's book on industry. Maybe it's in there. But certainly the nature of the firm brought to the fore the importance of transaction costs. If Oliver Williamson, one of the co-winners of the 2009 Nobel Prize, much of his work is built on and is inspired by Ronald Coase's work. And the generalization that has occurred, which Coase noted and was proud of, is that it became a theory of commercial contracting. We have all sorts of, we initially think of it first, okay, firm versus not firm. Well, you have different kinds of contracts. A franchise contract, for example. The McDonald's down the street may be owned by McDonald's, probably not. It's probably owned by a separate individual or a separate company.
It's an innovation.
That
structure.
And so where Coase's insight has been taken since 1937 by Oliver Williamson, by Armin Alchin and Harold Demsetz, by many others, is in the direction of explaining the contours of contracts and the details of contracts that otherwise would remain mysterious absent Coase's insight into transaction costs. Why have franchise contracts, for example? Why?
And what is their nature? What do they contract on? What do they care about? What are they worried about?
Exactly right. How do they change over time? What explains why they change over time. All of these explanations into the nature of commercial contracting find one way or another roots in Coase's 1937 article, which is an astonishing thing, that considering that a 21-year-old youngster wrote that.
Yeah, in a field where that's
exist.
Not the nature.
It didn't really exist.
There are fields where 21-year-olds make important contributions, but not often.
Usually mathematics, and there's no mathematics. Yeah. This is a straightforward insight. And just a quick footnote: the importance of that article. I think I'm correct in saying this. The importance of that article really took off in 1951, I believe, so some 14 years after it was published, when it was reprinted in the AEA Readings on Price Theory that was edited by George Stigler and Kenneth Boulding. I think it was not, the article was not given the attention that it subsequently got until it was reprinted in that famous reader. And when that famous reader came out, that's when we really see an explosion of work done on the theory of the firm.
I'm going to say one more thing about it and get your reaction. A paper we've talked about many times on this program is The Use of Knowledge in Society by Hayek, which is 1945 American Economic Review. So that paper, the theme of that paper is that prices convey knowledge and aggregate knowledge. There's a lot to be said about that paper. Maybe we'll do a podcast on just that paper sometime.
Oh, I'd love that.
That'd be fun. But that paper was about the power of prices to solve what came to be called the knowledge problem, the fact that a lot of the most valuable knowledge isn't stuff you can look up. It's not stuff you can compile in a report. It's stuck in the heads of people. And how do you leverage that knowledge? How do you get that knowledge to come into play when it's scattered among individual brains, scattered across time and space? And what Coase is saying really is that there are times when you forego. The timing of these articles is kind of ironic. Coase is writing in 1937, perhaps influenced by conversations with Hayek, as you suggest, but Hayek writes in 1945, and what Coase is saying before the fact is that sometimes you're going to give up that aggregation of knowledge, that ability of prices to convey knowledge, and you're going to solve that problem because you got to solve it. And people, there's a whole modern management literature about the culture and history and knowledge of an organization.
Yeah.
It's an obsession for a while in the 90s. I don't know if it's still an obsession. I don't follow this literature anymore. But how does an organization preserve the knowledge embedded in its employees, given that, one, they're scattered around the organization, and two, they die, three, they transfer, they quit, they get fired, they leave, and they take with them embedded in their brain a bunch of stuff. How do you get that knowledge out of them into some sort of accessible way? Of course, you can't. There's no easy way to do it, but especially in this context we're talking about, when you give up the competitive, market-driven outcomes that come from competition and price and quality competition, how does the firm solve that problem? So they have to find a way to not solve it, but deal with those issues.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just Coase was all about trade-offs. I mean, he recognized. I think there are no. This is quoting Sowell now, but it's a very Coasean notion that there are no solutions. They're trade-offs. You can reduce this cost only by increasing this cost, and what you hope is that the reduction in this first cost is greater than the increase in the subsequent resulting higher cost on this other front. And you want to make sure the economy is competitive. Coase was very clear. Coase was a very, very free market guy. You want to make sure the economy is competitive so that this balance is made as best as possible. And when external factors change, that the balance itself can change to reflect changes in external reality.
And to take a modern day application, you talk about changes in external factors, the ability of the internet to allow firms to find out just one of the most simple transaction costs that arise when you use the outside market, which is, what is the price, right? It takes time. When you want to go buy a car, you can't look up, well, what's the price of a car now? Well, now we almost can.
Yep.
A lot of people have access to that information. A lot of people, and I'm really thinking about the supply chain. If you're a firm and you want to buy something from the outside, you can at a very low cost, very quickly find out two usually very important things. The price itself, there's not a lot of legwork anymore. And secondly, whether people are happy with the quality. You get a lot of information that before had to be gained with a lot more uncertainty. So you'd expect that to change how firms are organized, what they produce in-house versus outside.
Yep. Yeah. So, and these things are happening all the time. And so you don't want a rigid template for what the world, quote unquote, should look like, except to say that it should be competitive. Entrepreneurs should be free to experiment with different methods of organization. Coase wrote or published that paper, The Nature of the Firm. You mentioned Hayek. An even deeper paper, maybe Hayek's most profound paper, is his Economics and Knowledge paper, published in 1937, the same year. And this is when Coase and Hayek are close together in London. And what those papers share is an appreciation of the I'm going to use a modern term, sort of the pixelization of knowledge. Knowledge is not a whole. It's spread out. It has to be captured. It has to be utilized. Different people utilize it differently. People have some different subjective reactions to it. You can see in Coase's work a lot of Hayekian influences, which themselves, may just be both from Hayek and Coase's perspective, the results of the intellectual climate at the LSE in the 1930s.
Yeah, London School of Economics.
Yep.
And before we're going to move on now, I think, to another paper, but I want to mention that longtime listeners will recognize that we've talked about the nature of the firm in lots of other podcasts. We'll put up links to it, but certainly I did a podcast with Mike Munger on it, and it may have come up in other places. I think it did, along obviously with the actual interview with Ronald Coase in 2012. Let's move on. Let's move on to the problem of social cost, which was really, I think is it the single most cited paper in economics still?
It was for a very long time. It would not surprise me if it still is the single most cited paper published in any economics journal. It's published in the Journal of Law and Economics. There's a great story behind that paper. George Stigler relates the story in his 1988 autobiography, Memoirs of an Unregulated Economist. And the story is that Coase, at the time when he wrote it, he was on economics faculty at the University of Virginia with Jim Buchanan and Gordon Tullock and Leland Yeager. And he presented it in a seminar at Chicago. And of course he sent it on ahead of time. And there was a dinner party the night before the presentation. I've heard different stories. I can't remember which one Stigler says, either at the apartment of Aaron Director or the apartment of Milton Friedman. But anyway, you had many future Nobel Prize winners there. Coase himself, Milton Friedman, George Stigler, Aaron Director was there. Many other luminaries, Alan Wallace in the economics profession. And Stigler says that when Coase arrived, when Ronald arrived at the dinner party, there was only one person in this room of 20-odd people who thought that Coase was correct. All these people were astonished that a careful economist like Ronald Coase could get something so fundamentally wrong.
That one person, of course, being Ronald
Coase. The only person who believed that Coase was correct was Coase. And Stigler said by the end of the evening, everyone in the room understood that Coase was correct. So here you have an insight that today, when we talk about it, it's going to sound almost trivial, and yet some of the greatest economic thinkers in history. When they first encountered it, it was so unbelievable to them, so unfamiliar, that they rejected it out of hand. Ronald Coase cannot possibly be correct. By the end of the evening, they all knew that he was correct. Stigler called it the most exciting intellectual evening of his life, this discussion of Coase's problem of social cost paper. There's a prelude to that paper, and that's the work that Coase did on, Coase, by the way, was British, although he spent his most productive years of his professional career at either the University of Virginia or University of Chicago, so in the United States. He did a 1959 paper on the Federal Communications Commission, and one part of that paper involved the allocation of the electromagnetic spectrum. How do we allocate it? And Coase,
for radio,
or I can't remember, for radio or television, for use of broadcasters. And Coase realized that regulators don't really have to worry too much about getting it right. I mean, just create property rights in it, make sure those property rights are secure, and then we can trust the forces of the market to ensure that each piece of the electromagnetic spectrum, if it's not initially possessed by its most valued owner, will eventually wind up at its most valued owner. This is simply an application of things we recognize about the economy in a routine way. If you value my watch more than I value it, you'll offer me a price for it, and I'll sell it to you. No one thinks that's astonishing. This happens all the time. It's very routine. And Coase said, look, those same market forces operate for non-tangible property rights in the same way that they operate for tangible things. And that's the fundamental, that's one of the fundamental insights of the 1960 paper, The Problem of Social Cost. So the proposition that, or I assume it's a proposition that Stigler referred to. By the way, Stigler is the person who named it the Coase theorem.
Unfortunately.
Yes.
To some extent.
The proposition was that if transactions costs are sufficiently low, some people say if they're zero, it doesn't have to be zero, they're just sufficiently low. People can transact. If transactions costs are sufficiently low, then the legal authority, whoever that may be, a court, a bureaucracy, an all-powerful monarch, it doesn't matter. The legal authority, if that legal authority's goal is economic efficiency, that's a big if, but if
and we'll come back to that, yeah.
The legal authority's goal is economic efficiency, and transactions costs are sufficiently low, the legal authority needn't worry himself, herself, itself terribly much about how to initially allocate the thing. Who do I give it to? Do I give it to these people over here? Just create property rights in it, give them out. It doesn't matter really who you give them out to. Those property rights will eventually wind up in the hands of the people who value them most, who can put them to the best economic use. If I'm given a part of the electromagnetic spectrum and I'm a terrible broadcaster, if I think that the best thing to broadcast is cricket noises, and then you think the best thing to broadcast is pop music, then eventually you'll purchase from me my part of the electromagnetic spectrum because you can put it to better use than I can. Now, if transactions costs are sufficiently high, then it does matter how property rights are initially.
It's expensive to negotiate it. We can't find each other.
Yes.
It's hard to.
Yeah.
Well, so this up to here, of course, on the surface, this looks like the flip side of the nature of the firm because it basically says, if costs are low, just use the market. Mm-hmm. Don't. Things are going to let the invisible hand work. Let competition and other things work. But of course, to me, that's and I learned this from Deirdre McCluskey when I was a first-year grad student in Chicago. The transaction costs aren't zero, and they're often not sufficiently low. So to me, the inside of the Coase theorem is not that one. Now that it's not. Well,
that is the Coase theorem. The inside of Coase's paper
yeah.
is not that. And Coase has said many times over the years.
He did on EconTalk as well.
And he very much regretted that the Coase, what's known today as the Coase theorem, is regarded as the main takeaway from that paper.
Because it became a straw man. It became a way for people to dismiss the paper by saying, well, since transaction costs, they're not zero. They're never zero.
Yeah.
Therefore, this whole paper is just a curiosity, an oddity. So before we do the second half of what Coase really thought was the deep insight, which I agree is the deep insight, it's worth noting that that dinner party where people didn't accept it, they didn't accept that first one.
They didn't accept that first one, and it's a curious thing to reflect on. Once it's stated, it becomes obvious. Why would people be any less willing and able to exchange disembodied property rights than they are willing to exchange physical things? If the transactions cost in both cases are sufficiently low, they'll do it. Now, in both cases, the transactions cost might not be sufficiently low, but there's nothing fundamental about property rights per se that makes them a different thing to exchange than physical things. And so that's the first part. That's really the simplest part of Coase's art. Let me say, I think Coase, in a way, overreacted to the popularity of the Coase theorem notion. I do think it is an important insight.
Right, it shouldn't be neglected.
It shouldn't be neglected. Right, it is an important. Their transactions costs are sufficiently low in many, many instances. I think in the case of the electromagnetic spectrum, they're probably sufficiently low. There's a pretty well organized. I think there's a pretty well organized market in those sorts of things. And if CBS owns more of the electromagnetic spectrum than NBC, and NBC can put it to a better use, they both have incentives to transfer that part of the electromagnetic spectrum that can be better used by NBC from CBS. We see transactions taking place every day, so transactions costs often are sufficiently low.
And to take an example,
in many cases,
I never really thought about it, but in a way, Coase is just saying economics. Markets work.
Yes.
When transaction costs are low. Again, it sounds trivial and simple. But to take another example, Julian Simon, who we both have a great deal of respect for, his solution to the fact that airlines have an incentive to overbook, but that imposes a cost on them because sometimes somebody gets bumped and is angry. So they have to be very careful of how they do that. Julian Simon came up with the idea of, well, let's just they should overbook because there's advantages of not having empty seats.
Right.
And if it turns out that too many people show up, then you can auction off and they don't literally auction them off. They basically say the first 3 people who come forward are going to get a free ticket. And now both parties are better, 3 parties are better off. The airline, the person who was bumped, and the person who still gets to stay on the flight who didn't have a seat. Yeah. And that is, in a way, that's the Coase theorem in action, because if you're before this innovation, you're sitting there thinking, I really want to go to Chicago, but it's sold out. I need to find somebody who's on that flight who's willing to get off the flight. And of course, that's really hard to do.
Yeah.
Do you knock on doors of people who travel to Chicago? Do you call up the airline and say, who's going to Chicago? I can outbid. And what this does is it's a way to allow that to happen in a low transaction cost way.
I hadn't thought about it. It's a good point. It's that need, that desirable action, that useful action is integrated into the firm. The airlines take it over.
Correct.
And it doesn't work perfectly. Nothing works perfectly, but it works pretty smoothly. So Coase, as with the firm, Coase wanted to explain things we observe routinely in reality that seem at odds with basic theory. The firm seemed at odds with basic theory. If markets work so well, why have firms? The law, as it exists, Anglo-American law at least, in the one that Coase was looking at, why is its structure as it is? What explains the details of nuisance law and property law and contract law? Coase was driving at in the problem of social cost. One of the things he was driving at, it's a really deep, multi-layered paper. One of the things he was driving at was that because we live in a world where transactions costs are often sufficiently high to block what would otherwise be mutually advantageous exchanges. The law itself takes on a character. The law itself takes on details. It takes on contours. It takes on substance that is best explained, just like the firm, as institutions to deal with these transactions costs, to minimize the ill consequences of transaction costs.
And in particular, he was interested in what economists call externalities, where my actions either
Social
harm
costs,
you or help you. And why is it in those situations some legal structures make more sense than others? So let's talk about some of those examples and what comes into play with transaction costs and what he was trying to explain.
Yeah. Well, of course, the most famous example is the rancher and the farmer. So, the railroads and the farmer. So you have railroads going through a field. That's a socially useful activity, but railroads throw off sparks, and sparks always run a risk of igniting crops growing nearby. So the railroad imposes a cost on the farmer. Now, that's how it's normally said. That's how we normally think about it. So we need a way to deal with this.
But we need a way to protect the farmer from the harm of the railroad, is the way it's usually said. So we got to punish the railroad for its actions.
And so the first pass at this, if the transaction costs between the railroad and the farmer are sufficiently low, right, then the law doesn't matter that much, right?
Explain what the law would be, the different choices.
All
that
the law would have
could
to do is simply declare one or the other as owning the right. Okay, Mr. Railroad, you have the right to run your train by, or Mr. Farmer, you have the right to be free of sparks. If they can bargain, then let's say the farmer is given the right. This is the Coase theorem. Let's say the farmer is given the right. If the railroad will buy from the farmer the right to run trains across or near that farmer's land up to the point where the value to the railroad of running that train is equal to the value, the risk to the farmer of having his crops burned. The farmer will be willing to sell to the railroad the right to impose a cost, to run the risk of burning its crops. And the same thing would work if the railroad had been given the right. The farmer, if it was more valuable to keep the railroad away, the farmer would pay the railroad to stop.
Or to put up some barriers that would keep the harm from happening.
Yeah,
so that's another way to think about this.
Yeah. The lowest cost ways of dealing with these things would emerge.
And that's really important, though, because we don't know what the lowest cost way. The regulator might not know. So for me, one of the insights of the Coase theorem is, do you impose a regulatory solution from the top down, or do you let it emerge from the bottom up? And what Coase was suggesting was that if transaction costs are relatively low, the low-cost solution will emerge through the natural interplay of these negotiations. And then the parties will have the incentive to improve that going forward.
Yes. This part of Coase's paper is a powerful defense, or a powerful explanation of the importance of secure property rights. People are secure in their property rights, and they can exchange those property rights. They have incentives to either exchange them if they can, or to take steps to minimize the damage to them, or put another way to maximize their value. You don't need a top-down regulator saying do this or do that, don't do this, don't do that. People will do that on their own. It's a really powerful insight. But a deeper insight, and this is one that Coase also emphasized, but it's just so deep, I think it still is not sufficiently appreciated, is the mutuality of harm.
Yeah.
When we talk about externalities, we economists talk about externalities. We typically, for whatever reason, it seems easy to identify the harmer and the harmee, or the lawyers would say the
perpetrator.
The tortfeasor and the tort victim. Right? But Coase said, look, it's not that easy. Take the railroad farmer example. It looks like the railroad is imposing costs on the farmer, but let's face it. Suppose the railroad had been there first, and then the farmer came by and started growing crops. Right? Well, then why don't we say the farmer is responsible for his own damage. It's true, the sparks physically come from a passing train, locomotive, but the farmer himself has some responsibility for where he sets up his crops, where he grows his crops. It's not clear that all the causality runs from railroad to farmer in terms of the harm. We have to look at it both ways. And when we recognize that all harm is mutual, then it's easier to recognize that the appropriate adjustment, the appropriate adjustment is not obvious. It's not
Correct.
necessarily the case that the railroad should stop running as many trains, or that the railroad should take steps.
Maybe it should be that the farmers shouldn't grow close to the railroad. That may be the cheapest way to cope with this problem.
Yes, that's exactly right. And so one of many insights, particular insights from this, is that Coase would predict, or did predict, that the manner in which the law actually classifies a perpetrator as distinct from a victim is that the perpetrator is the party that the law determines somehow is the lowest cost avoider of the harm. If the railroad can avoid the harm at a lower cost than can the farmer, then when the railroad runs its trains by, we say the railroad causes the harm, and so the railroad should be the party responsible for taking steps to minimize the harm. If, on the other hand, the determination made that the farmer is the lowest cost avoider, then we'd say the farmer avoids. The farmer is the perpetrator, and the farmer should take the steps.
Well, and I teach this. I sum it up by saying it takes two to tango.
Yes.
And the idea that externalities are mutual, this mutuality you're talking about, is disturbing. It's jarring. Because we often want to, and sometimes should, impose a moral judgment on harm, right? So if I came and I hit you in the face with my fist, and that annoys you, you could say, if you're not careful, you can say in a Coasean way, well, it's your problem. You should enjoy it, or you should just say it's no big deal, or it's just as much your problem as mine. And we all were repulsed by that logic, correctly. And so I think one of the most powerful aspects of Coase is taken to an extreme. I think it's dangerous to say, well, all we care about is minimizing the cost. That's not true. We do care about many times something more than minimizing the cost. We care about morality. We care about justice. But at the same time, what Coase forces you to acknowledge is that sometimes the morality you impose on an economic situation is false. It's not just a different metric. It's wrong. It allows you, it opens your mind to the possibility that you haven't imagined that there's a different way to handle this social problem.
That's right.
And the example I may have used on the program in the past, and I apologize, is that if you're hiking in Montana, you will encounter horse manure, and it's your job to avoid it. No one expects the horse owner to clean up after his horse. Although in Manhattan, the horse wears a diaper in Central Park because it's been culturally emerged, or it may be legal, but I think it's cultural, that there it's unpleasant, it's unexpected. So, but in Montana, there's no moral blame placed on the horse owner. If you step in the output of his horse, that's your problem. Why weren't you more careful? In the city streets of Chicago, and when I was there in the winters and springs and falls in the late 1970s, dog owners did not clean up after their dogs. Your job, everybody understood, it was culturally totally acceptable to leave that on the street, and only a fool would step in it. Keep your eye out. Keep a lookout. And today, that's not true. That's culturally changed for a bunch of reasons. Some of it's technology. I think the cheapness of plastic bags, and 100 other reasons.
Better understanding of the transmission of diseases, all sorts of things.
And a similar point about, it's the same point. Again, these examples and you start seeing the Coase theorem everywhere after you've started to think about it. When I spend the summer in California, it's the driver's responsibility not to hit pedestrians. Pedestrians in California are extremely aggressive. They're much more likely to cross the street carelessly because they're aware of the culture there. You come back to the East Coast and it's walker beware, and drivers are less careful. And so if you've been out walking in California for a summer, or if you grew up in California and you moved to New York or to Manhattan or Washington, D.C., you better be careful.
Yeah.
Because there's a different set of expected norms about whose responsibility it is, who owns property rights in the street.
Yeah.
And the cultural norm in Washington, D.C. and New York is the driver owns the road. And in California, it's much more the pedestrian owns the road. And there's nothing moral about that. Your first thought is, well, of course it's the driver's responsibility not to hit people. And it is true. But it's a question of, there's a continuum of care, which is another insight you get from Coase. It's an incredibly rich paper.
Yeah. There's a flip side to the important point you made, and that is our moral assessments are surprisingly determined by these economic factors. We regard the person, if you hit me in the face, is unprovokedly, you punch me in the face. It's true in a very technical sense that we both caused it. If my face weren't here,
correct,
it wouldn't hit her. If I had moved it, then your punch wouldn't have landed on my face.
Yeah, I'm just swinging my arm. You should have stepped aside.
Right. But morally, we reckon, if you want to reduce it to the economics, you're clearly the low-cost avoider. I'm not expecting you to hit me in the face. You swing, you're the low-cost avoider. Therefore, the moral blame falls in. Our very moral senses are determined in large part by transaction costs. A lot of people don't like that because we like to separate morality.
It's unsettling. So on this issue of morality and how the costs play a role, reminds me of this issue that arose when legislation introduced tradable emissions coupons for sulfur dioxide. And a lot of environmentalists were offended by this because of the morality of it. They said a firm shouldn't be able to buy the right to pollute. Polluting is harmful, and I don't care. We don't care about the efficiency or the other things. It's just wrong. So that's just immoral. And economists' reaction was very different.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that particular issue. I mean, and it arises in different related circumstances. The economist says, well, yeah, but pollution is not without benefits. I mean, it's the byproduct of a beneficial process. And so if you think that pollution is not immoral because it has the thing that produced it has beneficial consequences, why would you assume as a matter of morality that the harm is necessarily at the margin, necessarily greater than the benefit? Do you want to live in a society without any pollution? You can do that without any industrial pollution, but we'd have no pharmaceuticals, we'd have no petroleum fuel, we'd have a very different lifestyle. Our lives would be much more miserable. And so the economist points to the benefits of at least the processes that pollution causes. Economists, and Coase was very good at this, by the way, economists dismiss that kind of talk of morality more easily than do other people because we recognize that there are costs and benefits to almost any action.
And in this case where the firm, quote, buys the right to pollute, it's going to ultimately almost always end up passing those costs on to the consumer of the product, who I would argue morally is the person who should pay for it.
Yes.
So if there is pollution, that's the way it should be.
Excellent.
And people say, yeah, well, they should pay for it, not the firm. Well, the firm, don't worry, they do pay for it, not the firm. So I wish we could talk some more about this. I've been meaning for a long time to write an essay on it, on the Coase paper and the insights, the things I've learned from Coase. I have a preliminary version of that up on the Library of Economics and Liberty website, and you can, a related paper to it at least, and we'll put a link up to that. It's on the Napster issue that arose, which has, to me, is an application of Coase's insights. But we're going to move on. It's late in the day. We've got about maybe 10 more minutes. I want to talk briefly about the other two papers, the marginal cost controversy and the Lighthouse in economics. So let's take 5 or so minutes for each one to summarize why they were important.
The marginal cost controversy is a 1946 paper, and it has a very, like all of Coase's papers, it has this very simple insight. Economists will argue, say, well, efficiency requires output up to the point of where marginal cost equals price.
And define marginal cost.
Marginal cost is the cost of producing one additional unit.
A little bit more.
A little bit more, one additional unit of output. Right. And so there was this famous example back in the 40s. It's still famous. The uncongested bridge. Right. And so which should be the price of crossing an uncongested bridge? Say a motorist crossing which should be the toll? Well, says the naive economist, it should be zero, because the cost of putting aside the small wear and tear, right, that's de minimis. The cost of crossing an uncongested bridge is zero, and so that person shouldn't be charged a price.
Because they shouldn't be discouraged from crossing.
They shouldn't be.
You want them to cross.
That's exactly
the right
right. If you charge a toll, you'll have fewer people crossing the bridge. You'll have a social inefficiency. People who would get more value from crossing the bridge will be dissuaded from doing it, even though the social cost to them of crossing the bridge is less than the value that they would get. So we can't have positive pricing of such things. And Coase, this article too, we won't have time to get into it. This article too is a multi-layered article with many deep insights, but the one I like best, and I don't think other people have made it, but Coase made it in a particularly clear way. He said, look, one purpose of pricing, remember Coase was a student of Hayek. One purpose of pricing is not simply to prices convey information. It's not simply to allocate goods and services. They convey information. And so if we allow bridge owners to charge what the market will bear, right, then yes, if a bridge is uncongested and you have a positive price, say $2 to cross, if you look only at the individual drivers, some of them who should, quote unquote, should cross, won't cross, social inefficiency. However, if we force the price down to zero, as some economists advocate, because that's a socially efficient price, we lose the informational content of the price. We lose the informational content of how valuable is it to build new bridges, how valuable is it to expand bridges. And so Coase, a year after the use of knowledge in society, Coase is pointing out in the marginal cost controversy the important informational role of pricing and how that information would be sacrificed, destroyed, if some of the more naive economists' solutions for efficiency were implemented. If uncongested bridges, as an example, or other things that apply, if the price were forced down to marginal cost, and where the marginal cost here is zero, Coase said no, price should be what the market will bear.
But how do you do that in the case of a bridge where maybe the government built the bridge, the government's setting the toll? Where are you going to get this informational value if in that setting? Well,
he was talking, I guess, I can't remember exactly, imagining private bridges. If you have a private bridge owner, it's not inefficient for the private bridge owner to charge what the market will bear, even in uncongested times, because the efficiency of the information conveyed by prices has to be
to other potential bridge.
It has to be weighed against the inefficiency of dissuading at the margin some people who should cross the bridge from crossing the bridge. Coase went on in the paper. He discussed multi-part pricing schemes and explained the value of those and how they are superior to top-down regulation or outright subsidies.
Mm-hmm. And what about the Lighthouse, which I have to say, when I read it in graduate school, I think it was probably my favorite paper in many ways because it's so simple. It's a little historical episode, and it's eye-opening. It's a fabulous paper, and I thought this is the greatest.
It's very careful economic history done by most people don't think of Coase as an economic historian, but he did do. And this certainly was an economic history paper, and he was taking aim at standard textbook economics, as he did so often.
And by the way, I forgot, it has to be mentioned, the problem of social cost was in many ways a reaction to Pigou.
Oh, Coase
we forgot
really
to mention.
Disliked Pigou's work.
So the so-called Pigovian tax which is that when you have a negative externality, you should impose a tax on the so-called perpetrator, or the apparent perpetrator, was what Coase was reacting to, saying that sometimes that's not always the right policy. And I mention that only because the Pigovian tax of a carbon tax is often mentioned as the way to, quote, solve global warming. And I think what Coase would have said, and maybe he said it, and I think I probably mentioned on this program, is that that's one way to solve it. It might not be the best way. The best way might be to let global warming occur, if indeed it's happening, and to let human beings respond to it. And that might be cheaper than foregoing current output which the tax will produce.
Coase said basically, look, the world's a lot more complicated than your simple theory, you Mr. Pagoo, you.
Yeah.
I think it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that much of Coase's work, certainly after 1937, was a reaction to naive Pagoovian blackboard theory.
Yeah.
It looks very nice, it's all very scientific, but Coase understood that the real world has complexities in it that most economists overlook when they do their theories.
So coming back to the lighthouse,
a lighthouse is a very standard public good. The lighthouse is erected on the shore, it casts its beam, and any boat that wants to use any boat that needs guidance in storms or darkness to a harbor can look at the beam. So the reasoning goes in the standard textbook. Paul Samuelson is a textbook that Coase singled out, or one of the ones that he singled out in his article. So no private owner has an incentive to build a lighthouse because they can't charge for the benefit. You can't exclude.
Everybody can free ride. Everybody who can say, well, I won't pay because then I can still get the light.
And Coase said, well, let's look at the actual history of lighthouses in Great Britain. And he did that. He looked at the actual history of lighthouses in Great Britain. And what he found, it's too simple to say that what he found was that, oh, yes, they were all built by private enterprise and things. All right.
Sometimes it gets parodied that way, either by its proponents who love that conclusion.
Yes.
People who tend to be market-oriented like us, or by the antagonists who want to challenge Coase's thing and say, that's what he said. That's not what he said.
That's not what he said.
As always.
But he showed that in the history of lighthouses in Great Britain, it was in many cases driven by private enterprise. The contractual arrangements that harbor builders and dock or harbor people who manage harbors would arrange with boats, with ships coming in, were ingeniously designed to enable lighthouses to collect fees, to allow the suppliers of lighthouse services to collect fees for the provision of those services. The naive view that a lighthouse is a straightforward public good for which, unless it's provided outright by government and funded exclusively through taxation, and lighthouses early on in Great Britain were not funded in this way. They were funded by, I forget the term, harbor fees. They were funded in large part by fees that boat owners did pay. And so this is an example of Coase actually, well, let's look at the history. And the history of lighthouses is far more complex than you get by reading a standard, the notion you get by reading a standard textbook about a lighthouse.
And I want to bring that insight back to a related problem, which is common property, common resource property, which of course the ocean is. One of the challenges of the lighthouse is you can't, if you wanted a purely private profit-making entity to provide it, I can't say, well, my lane, this shipping lane will be illuminated by the lighthouse, the other ones won't, or only people who pay for it, as you say. Mm-hmm. I can't exclude the non-payers from the value of the beam at the lighthouse, so the implication is it can't be provided privately. Similarly, people would say, well, with common resource property, there's an incentive to overgraze the sheep, overfish the ocean. So common resource property has to be government regulated. Mm-hmm. And what Elinor Ostrom argued, and we did Pete Betke did a nice episode of EconTalk on this topic, on Ostrom's insights and others who have worked on this, is that, okay, there's something in between this market versus government solution. And my view is that that's the wrong dichotomy. We should really be thinking about bottom up versus top down.
Yes.
Top down, or a distinction I learned from Dan Klein, coercive versus voluntary.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of voluntary solutions to lots of problems that are not profit maximizing or what we would normally think of as private enterprise, but they're privately agreed to. So essentially in these two cases we're talking about, the lighthouse and the fishing of common resource property, norms emerge about what's acceptable behavior by the participants that aren't government run. They're not what we would think of as, quote, private enterprise, but they're voluntary and they're bottom up. So in the case of say, lobster traps in New England, where, yes, there's an incentive to fish all the lobsters, and then you've killed the goose that lays the golden eggs, to mix animal metaphors, sorry, but obviously the lobster people understood that. They're not idiots. So there was a natural incentive for them to find ways to work together. And in that case, there were norms emerged about property rights that aren't enforced in traditional ways. They're enforced in traditional ways, but not through government, not through police, not through the state. There were certain norms that emerge about who's allowed to take what, when, what you keep, what you throw back. And those norms are enforced by social interactions. The fact that the lobster people hang out together and somebody who cheats on the deal is then pushed out and is a pariah. So similarly, yes, once a set of agreements is reached about paying for a lighthouse, a person can come along and free ride on it. And if you do, you're not going to have any friends. The people at the dock are going to sabotage your boat. There's 1,000 things that are going to happen. You don't have to do it through the state. And again, to make it as Coasean as possible, you want the solution, whether it's the government-run solution or the emergent solution that's voluntary or some hybrid, to be the one that minimizes costs. Not necessarily the one. It's not necessarily a theoretical thing that emerges out of the blackboard.
A couple of closing thoughts. I know we're getting near the end. It's not. I think it's appropriate to summarize Coase's life work, or a theme. It's a Hayekian theme, as saying, look, if you try a social engineering solution, you could have the most elegant. Coase called it blackboard economics, and that was a derisive term for him. You have the most elegant model, right? And you could and put aside, public choice sorts of problems with bad incentives. You have knowledge problems. Your elegant model imposed in the best possible way on reality will always be too simple for reality. Reality, if bottom-up forces are allowed to percolate and operate, they will always devise more nuanced ways of dealing with the problem that outperform your elegant engineering models. Your Pigouvian tax looks nice on paper. Your Pigouvian tax won't work as well as letting bottom-up methods of dealing with these externalities operate. Shifting gears just a little bit, you're right. The market versus government dichotomy is mistaken.
And the way I think the worst way to think about it is profit versus social good.
Even better. And I think the last podcast we did was on Jim Buchanan. There's a connection here with Jim Buchanan. Jim Buchanan's presidential address to the Southern Economic Association, which was published, I think, it was 1963, called "What Should Economists Do?" Buchanan wrote this when he was still a colleague with Coase, I believe, at UVA, University of Virginia. Buchanan makes that point very clearly, and he gets it. People miss it. I don't know why. Buchanan is very clear that good economic theory is not just about profits. Good economic theory is about explaining what we observe people doing. And of course, Buchanan most famous by observing what people did in the political sphere. But in this article, he talks about private yet non-profit ways of dealing with social problems, things that Elinor Ostrom researched and won a Nobel Prize for.
Civil
by the
society.
way, she shared the Nobel Prize with Oliver Williamson, who, of course, was inspired probably most singly by the work of Ronald Coase. People get away too frequently with saying, oh, well, yes, markets are fine if they're perfectly competitive, if all private property rights are well defined, and if transactions costs are zero or very low. But this is not the world we live in. Therefore, and Ronald Coase, more than anybody, his work is an assault on that simplistic way of looking at the world. Unfortunately, that way of looking at the world remains. It is still the dominant way that Joe Stiglitz looks at the world. Paul Krugman looks at the world very much that way.
Most modern economists. Most economists that Pete Boudreaux calls
mainline.
Mainline. I get it confused. Yeah.
Mainline.
Yeah. Whereas,
I think.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. And look, we pass everybody in modern America today daily encounters institutions that no economist using standard, say, Joe Stiglitzian economics should be able to explain. Churches in America. I mean, yes, they get tax deductions, but they are all
decisive.
No, these things shouldn't exist, and yet they flourish. Many of them have lots of money. People voluntarily contribute to these things. They contribute money, they contribute time and effort. And whether you're religious or not, you can't deny the existence of them. You can't deny the thriving of them. You can't deny the influence of these things. You can't
deny the dynamism that results relative to a top-down solution from a government state-run religion.
Larry Iannacone, our former colleague at GMU, worked on this. And so we see these things every day. This is the kind of thing that Ronald Coase, you see these things every day. They are directly at odds with basic economic theory, with simplistic mainline economic theory. And we should be, I think the Coasean lesson, we should be more critical of the simplistic theory that we have. Simple theory, of course, is important, but we have to exercise far better judgment about its application. And what distresses me is the astonishingly poor judgment that even many prominent economists have about using their theory to analyze the real world. Coase had judgment on that front unsurpassed by anyone and matched by very few.
My guest today has been Don Boudreaux. Don, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Always a pleasure.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.